MakeReal specialises in creating immersive learning solutions across a range of technologies. To download their latest academic paper on how to turn learners into activists, visit makereal.co.uk/activists. Learning in the flow of work has got to be a good idea. Instead of taking people away from their work, why not get them to learn things as and when they need to know them in the course of their normal workflow? This idea has been around for more than 30 years, so are people actually doing it? And does it work? Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power.
Knowledge.
Education.
My guest this time has a podcast. Yes, I know what you're thinking. Everybody's got a podcast, but this guy's podcast, I have to admit, grudgingly, while it's not The Learning Hack, is a very good podcast. But that's not why he's here. We're talking to this fellow because he has commissioned a really interesting piece of research about learning in the flow of work, which gives answers to the questions I asked at the top. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact, who is he? Hack Facts.
David James has worked in people development for more than 20 years, most notably as Director of Talent Learning and OD for the Walt Disney Company across Europe, the Middle East and Africa. He is now Chief Learning Officer for 360 Learning, working with clients to develop and implement their digital learning strategies. David also hosts the Learning and Development podcast. And John, I gather you're appearing on his podcast in November.
I get around. So, Jay Curtis, Head of Themes. What themes emerged?
David's wealth of hands-on experience really came to the fore in helping to unpack the findings of his research. He says we build our own prisons in L&D, with the vast content libraries we feel we have to create and then get people to use. A major theme was time and the lack of it felt by both learners and L&D departments to do workflow learning, because they're too busy doing all that other stuff.
Here's an idea. Listen to the rest of this fascinating podcast while you're doing some boring filing or deleting spam emails or any other work-related task with a low cognitive load, and you will be actually doing it, learning in the flow of work. Well, sort of. David, I've long been an admirer of your podcast, and now here you are on mine. So welcome to The Learning Hack.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure.
We're going to be talking today about a really interesting research report you've commissioned. I think that's your role in it. You've commissioned it into learning in the flow of work. Workflow learning has been with us an idea for a long time. Just ask Bob Mosher, Guy Wallace, lots of people we've covered on the podcast and in Great Minds on Learning about workplace learning. But it really seems to have come to the fore in the past 5 years or so as a big thing, in that there's been a lot of talk about it. But I think what people will want to know from a report like this is, are people actually doing it? How many of them? What success are they having? And so on. So before we get into that, though, can you give us a bit of background to the report? Reasons for doing it? I always ask about the base with any research report. How many people? The scope and who carried it out for you?
Yeah, sure. So let me start with the base of the scope then, John. The survey was commissioned by 360 Learning, and I was involved in shaping some of the questions, but it was sent out to, and we had responses from just shy of 2,000, what we might call in the trade learners. I think they call themselves people, employees, plus just over 1,000 L&D decision makers in the US, the UK, France, and Germany. The idea was to find out what employees consider the most effective ways of learning in order to meet their goals and how L&D are meeting those needs. Now, I have known for a long time that there's been a mismatch between what we deem as high value, what we invest in, and what we encourage people to also see as the most effective ways in which we can help them to do what they're trying to do. But so many of the surveys ask people what they prefer or give them a menu and say, of all the things that learning and development provide, which one do you think do you prefer best? And I know this has been fatally flawed, and I think that this continues to feed our industry what we know and what we already believe. But I wanted to take this out of the hypothetical into the reality of the people that we're seeking to influence and base this on effectiveness, not preference of one way of delivering learning over another.
Okay, so let's get into that. There's often a question with learning in the flow of work about what we actually mean by the word learning. Workflow learning is an approach that leans heavily on performance support, going back to Gloria Geary, and actually in some accounts on reducing the amount of learning you actually do. So the resources versus courses, Nick Shackleton-Jones thing, will mean that you end up doing less learning. Mm-hmm. What was your definition of learning with this report? Because sometimes people talk about learning in the flow of work, and what they really mean is learning at the desktop. So basically just e-learning. Did you specify a definition in the way that you asked the question, or did you let the responders tell you what they thought it meant with the way they responded?
Yeah, so answering that last question first, we wanted to find out what people were trying to do and what was more effective. And we tried not to state what learning and development expects them to do. So we're not asking how best do you learn at work. We're asking what is it you're trying to do when you're when you're trying to learn, and what has been most effective. Because I completely agree with you that with the Nick Shackleton-Jones interpretation of this is that performance support done right, which is useful in the context of what people are trying to do at the time they're trying to do it, should eliminate learning. Again, Nick Shackleton-Jones's words. We only need to learn something really when there's a gap between the exposure to content and application, and usually there's a large gap. You bump into something that you realize you can't do. You book on a course or you schedule some time to do some learning. Now, that might be hours, days, weeks, sometimes months in order to get there. And then you have the experience, and then you have to wait for the situation to occur again in order to practice that stuff. Or you might engineer it. But again, this can be a huge amount of time. And of course, we relied on learning in the same way as we relied on remembering. When reading this from books, but I've got all sorts of problems with the word learning in the context it's often used in learning and development. I'm sure it's been explored many times on your podcast, because learning in the flow of work doesn't actually speak to the people we're seeking to influence. This speaks to the L&D profession, one that recognises learning as perhaps the main tool in our toolkit. If I was going to rebrand this and still speak to L&D, I would call this L&D in the flow of work. So we recognise our role in order to influence the way that work is done when unfamiliar situations and challenges occur, in order to get people to do what is the most efficient or effective way of doing something within the culture that they're expected to perform. So exhibiting the expected and rewarded behaviours in order to do the work, in order to do enough of the right stuff and therefore get the results. But there's a hell of a lot packed into there. And a lot of that challenges a paradigm that I think is overly accepted within our profession, which is almost taking a term, an emerging term, overlaying that over existing practice, and then everybody saying they already do it. You're to your point before, which is courses on desktops is not learning in the flow of work. It's a way that I think that the vendors and marketing, and perhaps some practitioners, naively or maybe not, have determined that what they do or what they offer is this new thing. I think it stops our profession from evolving. I think it stops us from improving the impact that we make. But also, I think that it makes us into almost jargonistas. That we sell these approaches to our people in ways in which we almost share with them that we think that they've got it wrong. And I think that for too long, we've said that, and we've got all these excuses as to why things won't change for an employee if we don't get senior level buy-in, if we don't get a learning culture, if their line manager isn't involved, if senior leadership aren't bought in, and if the learning isn't transferred back to the workplace. I consider this like trying to balance loads of china on a tray, that this will never succeed getting back to the workplace, because there are all these variables. It's all piled up so high, and it's all so fragile. Whereas learning in the flow of work in its very essence is being, and this is just simply to quote Gottfredson and Moshe, being there at the moment of need in order to influence the moment of apply. You bring your solution as close as you can to the need that is determined, and you know there are ways in which you do this. And I think that philosophically speaking, I think it's important to think like this, because there are many ways of achieving it. But how close can you be to somebody who needs our help in order to influence the way they do something, ideally for the first time, or in the formative phase of transition or enforced adaptation, so that we have a say in how they actually do that. Now, John, the learning will occur with successful or unsuccessful doing. It's the only way. But being there in order to provide the guidance and support that people actually need will get us a great deal closer to efficacy than relying on overwhelming people with far too much content, either before or after those situations occur, and then trying to create something, in inverted commas for the audio listeners, engaging enough to be sticky and then affect how work is done. But yeah, going back to your point, this isn't actually about learning in the flow of work. This is about being there at the moment of need to influence the moment of apply. And
your survey, interestingly, contained a load of learners, as well as, we can call them learners for shorthand, as well as L&D people. Do you think both sides understood the same thing by the word learning, or do you notice any kind of discrepancy there?
So this is where we had to be judicious with the word learning, because my experience of 15 years in-house, and if you ask people how they learn, they tell you on training courses. That's it. If you ask people what they prefer, a day off work or doing some e-learning, oh my god, like day off work. When you ask loaded questions, you get your loaded responses. So what we had to do, we had to strip that out. We had to ask people what they were trying to do when it came to getting better at the job, and their aims for their own development and growth at work. So we had to frame it in such a way that they could tell us why they wanted to learn and develop at work, what their primary motivations were, and what the most effective ways of them achieving that goal was. When it came to learning and development, we wanted to talk about how they invested their resources in order to help people with the reasons they wanted to engage in learning and development, and how they knew it worked. So we did ask different questions, and we loaded much more the learning and development professional side, because we're using our jargon, but we wanted to open it up for the learners, the employees, to tell us what they believe was most effective in them achieving their primary goals.
So what were the standout findings of the research for you?
So there were many. If I start from the employee side, time is always a factor when it comes to learning and development. At Disney, I used to dread the annual employee engagement survey coming around, because when it came to my department, it was decided we were going to ask one question: do you have enough time for learning? John, I got a kick in every year. An absolute kick in, because no one has enough time for learning. And 2/3 of respondents on our survey said that they learn as they go. They take the opportunity to speak to others, or they look it up, and that was deemed their most effective way of doing so. Around 20% of people scheduled a small amount of time each day, and 12% of people committed what they thought was in their best interest, a day a year for training. And as fast as skills and the workplace is moving on, I always have thought that a day a year of training is far less sufficient. 51% of people said that they would make more time for learning if they could do it on the job. And then we got down into, so what do you do it for? Now, 3/4 of respondents said they pursue learning at work simply to do their jobs better. Now, I think this is a revelation. First of all, this is consistent with what Towards Maturity have been telling us for years as well, that when you ask people, what do you do this for? They say, to be better and faster at my job. Now, when you look at what so much is provided from learning and development, it's largely remiss of context. Now, I'll come back to that because it's an important factor that was brought up for us within this. I've got 5 additional points before just so your listener knows. I'm not going to talk endlessly about this, but 5 other points. The consensus is that L&D programs are most useful when they empower employees to tackle challenges of their current job even more skillfully. So as much as we want to talk about upskilling for the future, people are trying to do the thing. They know as well as we do. Sticky learning occurs when you are faced with a challenge in your job, and then you overcome that with more effective or efficient ways of doing so. Learning from peers was considered by learners to be the most effective way of learning. 2/3 of respondents said that it was very effective in helping them with how to do their job. That was closely followed by coaching and mentoring and instructor-led training on the job. So all of that is totally context-driven. Each one of those will be either in the guidance and support or the exploration of context. Now, this was a huge one. And again, I think we all know that long-established online learning, such as e-learning, virtual workshops, or MOOCs, recommended by my organization, so again in inverted commas because that was the question, were considered by only 29% of UK respondents as effective. Now, we know that there's a huge amount of money within that, and we didn't ask them whether they liked it. We didn't ask them whether they preferred it. We asked them whether it was effective in what they're trying to do at work. And then we explored with them a couple of examples. We know that everybody's been through some level of onboarding, and we asked about the onboarding effectiveness and also first line manager training. So we asked the question, are you a line manager, and how effective was your onboarding as a manager? And this was stark. The biggest criticism for first line managers was that it's too generic and not specific to the practical situations that they face as managers. Again, we know this, but I think we've been turning a blind eye, thinking that we can build generic managers with transferable skills across organizations and equip them with what they need in highly contextual, very specific roles, departments, and teams with different clients, customers, and stakeholders. But the answer that we got overwhelmingly is that we can't.
In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet who uses it, despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy? I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors, and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. One thing I particularly noticed was that, and you mentioned it earlier, was that lack of time was given as the biggest blocker, both by learners and by L&D employees and by L&D. How do you interpret that? Because my experience as a manager, such it is, was often that people would say they didn't have the time to do something or to think about something. Very often when you drilled into it, that was about something else. So I wonder how you interpret that, given that learning in the flow of work is really meant to save a lot of training time if done properly. I mean, in other words, it's widely felt to be a more efficient way to do things as you cut out a load of wasting both the learner's time and the L&D time with, constant provision of training that is poorly focused. A lot of that then becomes, I don't know, checklists or resources, as Shackleton-Jones would have it. And you concentrate your resources on deep learning, where you actually need to do that thing of getting past the forgetting curve. I mean, it would seem like a no-brainer that this is going to save you time as an L&D person. So how do you interpret that, the result that comes back that they haven't got time to do it?
We've got to consider that what the role in any given organisation of L&D is. A lot of the time, we build our own prisons. We build a curriculum that means that it's either heavily administrated or it still requires an internal team to deliver. And we've got our big systems full of content that people aren't going to willfully, because only 29% see it as effective. And so we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to drive traffic towards it to justify the expenditure, whilst also convincing ourselves it's because our people don't know how to learn. So there are these things that zap up our time that we think is the right thing to do because it's what people ask for, it's what people say is popular, but we can't do anything else. But I love again the Bob Mosier and Conrad Gofferson have led largely the narrative around this for many years, and so they would say, but if you start where people are actually having challenges and work backwards, you can more directly and laser focused affect them and equip them to do the things that they're trying to do that they're not able to do, either efficiently or effectively, and then work backwards. And then what you do is you plug the gap, as you said, with a deep learning experience, but starting where there's a challenge and where there's friction, especially as people are expected to transition or there is enforced adaptation. So what I mean by there is we all transition into an organization. We might transition into departments, roles to a new level. We might progress to management and leadership. We might move to a different team. We're expected to transition. These are the points at which our learners, our employees, need our help most, and that is where L&D is largely absent specifically when they have that need. And then enforced adaptation is when systems, processes, or technology changes, and we're expected to do either a different job to achieve the same ends or a different job to achieve different ends. And what I mean by that is that digital marketing largely changed to achieve different ends in the context of the job. You do something different to achieve something different. So if we can apply our attention to be there, then we have a greater opportunity to influence people. So in the work that I do now, I'll be consulting with, say, a client who wants to establish first line manager development. And so to recognize, first of all, what it is that they're trying to achieve. And so you want more confident and competent line managers, perhaps. Maybe they've got top talent leaving because of inexperienced managers, or they're just not productive when they're first promoted. Then you'll seek the experience of the people that have recently been promoted as line managers, and you say, what would have been really helpful for you to adjust and assimilate quicker? You know what they say, John? They don't say, well, I think that performance coaching would have been really helpful, or to understand team dynamics. What they say to you is, I want to know what to do first. Like, what's the role of manager in sales at this company? What tricky conversations will I expect? What might surprise me? It's really basic stuff that's stopping people from understanding their new place and some of the fundamentals to get a rung on the ladder. They don't even know where the ladder is. So all of this stuff, when people actually need the guidance and support, can be put in place. And then later down the line, you might do your grow model, you might do your Tuckman and the dynamics, and that stuff might be able to wait. But in the meantime, you've got a cohort of people that are being promoted at different times who are looking to solve the same problems that have already been solved thousands of times in your organization, because they don't have access to the information, know-how, and insights that would really benefit them when they actually need it. And so this is the big opportunity with learning in the flow of work. And it doesn't replace anything except fumbling around and trying to solve the problems that have already been solved.
At the risk of using our favourite L&D cliche, there's a bit of an elephant in the room in this discussion, it seems to me, which is compliance.
Yes.
We haven't mentioned compliance at all, but when it comes to the time issue with training, it's got to be a factor. There's a lot of stuff that people don't necessarily want to do because it'll help them do their jobs better and faster, but that they have to do to stop the company getting sued. Did that figure at all in the findings of the research report?
No, we didn't ask the question on that, John, because we've got to be really clear. So one of the questions you'd ask is what's this for? What are you trying to do?
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to compliance training, we're not trying to train people. We're covering our backsides. Let's be really clear. So the organisation needs people to go through some training, to answer a certain amount of questions in order to cover our backsides. That's it, really. But if we were truly intent on influencing what people did, we wouldn't be educating them on regulation and the law. We would be providing them with the situations and circumstances that may occur in the context of their job and helping them to make the right judgment calls in the context. But the reason we don't do that is the compliance team and the legal team don't see that as the job. We need to make sure that we are absolutely watertight when it comes to anything that occurs in the future that may see us in breach. It's about devolving culpability from the organisation to the individual. Therefore, the current way works. Yeah, it's painful. People don't like doing it. And we don't know whether it actually affects judgment, but that's not the intent. It's culpability. It's devolving culpability from the organisation to the individual, and that's the purpose. Therefore, we don't need another way of delivering that.
In terms of taking up people's time, in certain industries which have a big regulatory load, like kind of pharma and financial services, particularly, I've heard people say, "Oh God, I had to do 10 hours of compliance training last month before I even got anything done." Does that kind of tend to soak up time that could be otherwise spent on helping you to do your job better and faster?
I think it's an awful waste of time. And I also think it reduces the credibility of the learning and development team to be associated with that type of training. But as I said, like the intent of compliance training is rarely to affect judgment. It is to educate and educate on the law and regulation in a broader sense, do enough testing so that were auditors to come in or were there to be a breach, it would be watertight, and then to move on. I just don't think that there's enough motivation inside or outside of learning and development to make that less painful. Now, I have seen it done really well at an online retailer that I did some work with. They decided to do some health and safety training, and they filmed it within their building. And they were talking about not just manual handling, but how to carry rails between the floors. That was highly specific to their situation. People looking around going, "Oh, this is for me." Right? And that wasn't at all painful. But then there was the UK Bribery Act rubbish that I had to do at Disney when that came in 2010. And these animated videos, and I'll never forget it, John. There was somebody said, "You've been offered 2 tickets to match of the century." And these were the words: Barcelona against Manchester. And I was there, and you're going, this is awful, right? And so that was the beginning.
Need a bit of a localization team there, I think. Yeah.
But again, what's it trying to tell me? It's trying to educate me on the regulation and the law, not trying to tell me how this might affect me when I was in HR. It was, it's far too generic. But when it comes down to it, if we're creating top-down, one-size-fits-all compliance training, it's far less expensive, and we also outsource the pain to the individual, rather than if we did this as a bottom up. How do we truly try to affect people and make it painless? I just think that 10 hours of compliance training, when you do outsource that, the pain of that to the individual, I think that the organization doesn't suffer. L&D does suffer, as I said, but I just don't think it's a pain that's being experienced keenly enough that too many people want to change that.
Sticking for the moment with the subject of time, I thought it's really interesting in the report that, and people talked about how they wanted to schedule their learning. Some people would schedule a bit for themselves every day, as you said, but very few people really thought that kind of external courses a day away, a week away on external courses was a good way of doing it. Do you have a comment on that? Because it seems to be a big vote in favour of learning in the flow of work.
Yeah, so the questions were all about effectiveness, and that was what I was absolutely keen to do. That if we go down the line of preference, that survey's been done. It's been done hundreds of times before, and it goes to back up what we already know about learning and development. That people prefer the time away from work. They like getting together. They prefer that over e-learning, and if that was once a year, it's preferable to any other state. But were you to ask them how effective that is in helping them to do what their primary reason for learning is, which is to do the job better, it can't. You know that one trade, and this is something that employees have known for a long time. I've said previously, John, that learning and development at its most basic level is a dance everyone thinks they know. Employees turn up for the day, they do the thing, and if it doesn't, and without too much application, they can get away with not really transferring that back to the work, because I've heard it many times. Anybody who's worked in learning and development in organizations heard, if nothing changes, the training didn't work. Then the manager agrees that the training didn't work. This dance we all think we know is nothing sophisticated. It's a conga line. Everybody just grabs hold of the person in front, kicks their leg, and they feel great immediately afterwards. But I think that, and I saw this at an away day that I did supporting somebody else with facilitation many years ago. They had new graduates in a room, and they were going through what I recognised as a training day. You and I would, from back in the day. And this group of graduates had no tolerance for it. You could see there was zero tolerance. Now, what you could say is that these young people coming through, they don't have any respect, or, iPhones have killed their concentration spans and all of this stuff. What I think
people do say that, yes.
They do, yeah. But I think with a wealth of information at our fingertips, I think we've grown an intolerance to stuff that we can't see the value in. And this goes back to learning the flow of work. And I know it's crass to compare consumer habits with corporate habits, because sometimes they don't cross over. But if you really wanted to do something, some DIY at home, or cook a recipe, you know what you do. You just Google it. The most appropriate resource that you found would help you to get from not knowing to doing in the shortest possible time. You'd do it, and then you'd move on. You'd buy the stuff or the ingredients or the materials you needed. You'd have a go at the thing with a bit more confidence and competence than you would if you didn't, and then you'd move on. Neither of us are plumbers as a result. Neither of us are chefs as a result, but we are far more equipped. Now, if you transfer those graduates back to the situation where they feel as if they can achieve a lot more with a bit of context, a bit of know-how, and then some time to do, they would see that as a better use of their time than sitting through somebody going through half an hour convincing them to care, 10 minutes to have a conversation. And you know how a day of training goes. They're sitting around going, what is this? I mean, it seems old-fashioned. It seems largely hit and hope that some of this might land. They know none of this actually relates to the job that they're going to be expected to do. They're going along with it because there are people in the room that probably will have a say on their careers. But my goodness, you could see that there was an intolerance. And I think that's an elephant in the room, that we consider those high value in learning and development because we apply so much of our attention and resource towards those. But were we to ask the hard questions like, did that actually achieve an outcome that was desired prior to the design of that intervention? I think we'd walk away knowing that it was never, ever designed to truly impact how somebody does something specific in our organizations.
So could you sum up your recommendations for action in the light of this research? How are we going to make learning in the flow of work and mainstream?
Right. So I think that first of all, like this requires a stepping back from the solution. Learning the flow of work is a solution that's looking for a problem. But I think that rigor is the most important part to this. We can't escape data and evidence-based practice any further. I really don't think taking a learning need or a training need as simply an assumption, seeking data to validate that is actually a problem worth solving in our organizations is a huge step towards us wasting time and resource any further, and then looking back and wondering whether there was any return on investment. Because without data at the outset to say that there was a problem, we will never know whether there was whether we achieved any meaningful impact. But data and evidence-based practice, I think, is absolutely essential. Aiming to address performance at the point of need, I think, should be a philosophy before it's a methodology. And what I mean by that, and this is my second point, after we recognize that there is a problem and it's being keenly experienced by those we seek to influence, by thinking, how close can we get to when they experience this problem? Can we actually try to affect them? And I think that's the philosophy there, because I can say, well, you'll be wanting to use a digital adoption platform. And then somebody says, well, I work on an oil refinery, and they go, no, but it won't work there. So stop thinking of solution, think of a philosophy. Where are they working? Where are they actually doing the thing that they need most help with, the most guidance and support, and how close can we get there? And then I think we work backwards. I think that is absolutely critical. To make sure that L&D, it's my third point, to make sure L&D are on track, we should hold ourselves accountable to the employees' KPIs, not a learning metric. Now, the vendor will tell you, no, we can't do that with our behemoth platform, with our generic content. And it doesn't matter. Like, we should, like, if that person in an office or the oil refinery is being held accountable to a KPI, we should understand that KPI. And then we should test whether we have been effective with our solution on whether they are able to do their thing more easily or efficiently with our help. And I do understand that there are many more variables and factors, but if you are looking at the data and you are understanding this with the people responsible for the work, then you will have everything on the table. There's communication issues, there's a process issue, there's a relationship issue, there's an access issue. And then down here, there's a little bit of capability and skill, and L&D can pick that up. But everything's on the table. The stakeholder sees it, the employee sees it, and then we can decide to make a move on all of those, one of those, or none of those. But we can test and iterate to see where we're making an advance. And then the final part of it, John, is don't tell stakeholders you're trying something new and different. Only ask questions about outcomes and work with them, and so that you are working towards making a difference you all agree is important, rather than seeking permission on doing a new and novel thing when they expect you to deliver training.
I can't let you go without asking you to talk a bit about your background in learning, because you've had a fascinating career, which includes 8 years at Disney. I'm interested in kind of how specific that was, because, you know, when you work for a huge brand like that has become, you know, the name gets spun off into, you know, we talk about Disneyfication, for instance, and, you know, people have a certain idea. How specific was it being a learning leader for that workforce? And then you've been vendor side with Loop, and then recent changes. I think you got bought. If you can talk a bit about all that and how your career trajectory has shaped your ideas about learning.
Yeah, sure. So if I start with the Disney part, from an aesthetic perspective, it was, you know, it's a huge modern building on Hammersmith Roundabout in London. So
don't kill the magic. Don't kill the magic.
So the location isn't as glamorous, but inside it, I mean, it's full Disney. It's there's a whole floor for the Disney store. There's a whole building for the Disney Channel. There is parks and cruises. Every part of Disney that you as a consumer will experience is there. And then you've got the back office elements, such as ad sales, finance, legal, and all of that, all contained in one building. my role in learning and development was very different to anywhere else, and I never took it for granted that Disney can, of course, attract some of the smartest, driven people that you can possibly imagine, and they bring with them an association for Disney that they've had since they were a child. So they bust a gut, regardless of line management capability, to achieve their best and do something important. It's an organization that celebrates every Oscar win, like together. We did that. There was a moment during my first year when when Ratatouille won an Oscar.
Great film.
But yeah, it's a great movie, and I'm not ashamed to say I felt an enormous sense of pride within that we did. There were loads of Oscars afterwards, so the sheen soon wears off. But there is this collective pride there, and so when you are speaking with stakeholders about a change that they want to affect within their organization, when you're doing a 360 for somebody who's very ambitious in the creative team, or you're working on an integration with an HR business partner, you're doing something quite important. And so I enjoyed them in all sorts of different ways. And I'd say that I really grew as an L&D professional at Disney. I joined as an advisor. By the end of 2006, I was running the UK Learning and Development team. By 2012, I was running Learning Talent and OD for EMEA. And at every stage, I was gaining a greater exposure for myself and in the types of meetings I was in, as well as anyone knows, as you rise in the organization, being exposed. You've gone from being sheltered within the HR and L&D team to being right up there and working with the president of the EMEA operation on his talent planning, and being in some very candid conversations about how people are perceived and their career trajectories. It was an amazing experience. I'd say 8 years was enough, because as much as there was excitement, really, I don't think. Well, I haven't kept it a secret previously. The learning technology was abysmal. It was absolutely horrendous. I felt that not only did I not have a technology arm that actually helped me to achieve what I was in the organization to do, I think it actually held us back because we spent so much time, and I used the language earlier, justifying the investment in a platform no one wanted, full of generic content that no one saw the value in, coupled with compliance training that people told me they had going on in the background while they were doing their work, so that it showed that it was done. So there was no way we could achieve what we wanted to with across 125,000 employees globally with that dreadful system, which was one of the reasons I left and joined Loop, because when I first saw the platform as a prototype, I said to Ben, one of the founders, this is the first piece of learning technology I've ever seen that I would use myself. And so I wanted to, it's really easy. I'd never consider myself being a vendor. I always saw it as a thankless task. I saw so many, I made it, I represented Disney, John. And so I couldn't just say no to everyone, but I'd probably meet 2 or 3 vendors a week. And sometimes I'd meet them and think, wow, you deserve a medal for trying to sell this, because it was just so off. So off what I wanted. But I mean, sometimes I looked and went, wow, you've got customers. And so I never saw myself doing it, but I hugely admired them for doing it. But
has the standard got better, do you think?
Has the standard got better? I think that it's a difficult one to generalize, because I think that there are some outstanding solutions in the learning and development field, in digital more broadly. If you look and say, for example, what HubSpot is doing for marketing, you could use something like that within learning and development, and you can make a huge difference. So I'd say technology more broadly has improved, but I think that there still are far too many people in learning and development, have never worked in learning and development, have interpreted the needs of learning and development as completely different from what it actually is. And I've said it before, it's like looking through the keyhole of a house, of a huge house, and thinking, I know what's in that house. It's a chandelier and it's a big hallway. So what they need is, you're thinking, unless you've actually know what it is that those people are in the organization to do. Everything looks like it needs to be more engaging training. And that couldn't be further from what is actually needed in organizations. Going back to the report that we've just done here, there are clues when people don't engage in online learning, and 29% of people say that only 29% of people say it's effective. That is a big clue that we're doing the wrong thing, not that people don't know how to learn. When people say they don't have time for learning, we don't break it down into the same stuff into micro learning and think, well, we'll solve that. We still haven't gone back and understood what is it that they're trying to do. There are clues within here. And that's why, again, my recommendations start with knowing, start with data and evidence-based practice. So we get out of the hypothetical, we get out of the broad assumptions, and from aggregating common needs and trying to address these with standardized solutions across multiple geographies and multiple levels. None of that will ever work unless we truly understand what it is that we are trying to affect. So going back to your question, John, I think there's some really good stuff, but if anybody thinks the future of learning is the next new and novel modality for delivering content, then they are greatly deluded.
So bring us up to date. You've recently been through a bit of M&A activity. I'm sorry to be foggy about this, but can you fill us in on that?
Yeah, sure. So we're very fortunate that Loop was acquired by 360 Learning at the end of 2021. We shared a common belief that the vast majority of learning needs within an organization are linked to context, which emanates largely from the question, how do you do the right things around here? At Loop, we believe that you take that knowing and you create custom resources in order to that are laser focused, that seek to affect the way the work is done, and 360 look to achieve that at an enterprise level by both understanding what people need, by engaging in dialogue about what it is that they're trying to do, and then engaging subject matter experts in helping to plug those gaps. So yeah, we've the Loop team have joined forces with the 360 Learning team in order to make what I believe is a huge gap in the market, because it's what people say that they actually need, a reality, and try to challenge the prevailing belief that the bigger platforms filled with more content and more engaging content are going to make any difference, even though 30 years in the profession or 30 years of technology and learning and development have shown us otherwise.
So it's not so much about content, it's about context. Our context is a 40-minute podcast, so I'm afraid I have to bring content to a close here. Now, it's been really great to talk to you today. Thanks for coming on the podcast, and good luck with your own offering, which I know is extraordinarily popular within the industry. Thanks a lot, David.
Thanks, John. And if I could just extend an invitation, I'd love to have you on my podcast too.
Right back at you. I'll be there.
Brilliant. Thanks, John.
Cheers.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to all our sponsors. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Next time, we'll be returning to the theme of virtual reality. We covered the theory behind VR and metaverse in a recent episode of Great Minds on Learning, but next time on this podcast we'll be examining a real, actual case study of a learning project in VR. Till then,
stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.